When it comes to selecting a planning solution for clients, the endowment is often selected as the most appropriate solution for a particular client. However, the selection process doesn't stop there. Often, the next question is to consider whether the client should invest through an endowment with a life assured attached to the policy or invest in the so-called sinking fund. Hannes, what's your thoughts on this?
Marius, that's a very good question. Life insurance bond or sinking fund, or as it's called in the MWI range of products, capital redemption bond. But before I address the question, I want us to clarify some of the terminology. The term sinking fund was used for the first time in the early 1700s and was used in the context of government debt and specifically repaying government debt. A government that issued a bond that became due in, for example, 10 years, had to plan to repay the capital of that bond. And to do that, the government would create a savings plan to pay off the debt at the end of the term. A sinking fund, in other words. So the term finds its origins in Britain and Italy. Today, the term has more of a generic meaning, and Investopedia defines it as similar in concept to a sinking fund for a corporation that issues and repays bonds. A sinking fund for household finances involves setting aside a certain amount of money each month to help pay off debts or to fund larger purchases in the future. The idea is that by consistently saving relatively small amounts of money, there will eventually be enough stored up to spend on or pay off something very significant. Today, the term can be seen as a generic term that refers to a savings plan with a focus term and objective, and it's no longer exclusively about payment of debt. Within the South African context, the Long-Term Insurance Act defines a sinking fund as follows. Sinking fund policy means a contract other than a life policy in terms of which a person, in return for a premium, undertakes to provide one or more sums of money on a fixed or determinable future date as policy benefits. Now, in this definition, a life policy is also important because it carries a very specific definition. And when it's boiled down to its most basic definition, a sinking fund in the SA context means essentially an endowment policy governed by the Long-Term Insurance Act, but without an insured life. Nothing more to it. In addition, we also need to define an additional term, and that is a capital redemption bond. This is a financial term that we often find in offshore jurisdictions, and it is essentially a reference to what we define as a sinking fund. So nothing magical about a capital redemption bond. Capital redemption bond, or CRB, is broadly similar to a life assurance contract. The notable difference are that the CRB has a maximum term of 99 years and its longevity is not linked to lives assured, as the CRB does not have any. There are no lives assured, then when the owner dies, the CRB continues and can be passed on through a succession of subsequent policyholders without interruption or incurring any unintended penalties or early surrender charges. Marius, for me, the main difference between the two forms of an endowment can be found in the absence of a life insured. If you were to ask me to identify the one distinguishing characteristic between the sinking fund policy and the life-linked policy, it will be this absence of an insured life. But what does all of this mean? What's the relevance of what I've told you now? It means that in planning scenarios where the savings goal should be disconnected from the death of a person, the sinking fund is more appropriate. Where trusts or other legal entities wants to plan for a savings goal without making it subject to the death of a person, the sinking fund is more appropriate. And as we know, directors, shareholders in companies, in legal entities often change. So that's often why you want to disconnect it from an insured life.
Agreed.
Yeah. Since there are no forced liquidation at the death of an insured person, the product can be used as a legal and effective tax deferral tool. The next point to make is that the sinking fund is sometimes less complex to put up. Life insurance bond gives you more planning opportunities. Capital redemption bond, sinking fund is sometimes easier to implement. And then specific purposes can often be better achieved by using the sinking fund. And I'm thinking here of asset swap, something that we'll discuss in a moment or two. But Marius, the life insurance bond has certain benefits as well. Can you perhaps mention some of those to our viewers?
Sure, Hannes. If you look at the life insurance bond, planning opportunities are very comparable to a trust from an intergenerational planning point of view. So what you can do, you can add a lot of lives assured to a life insurance bond from a longevity point of view. So you can keep up your succession nomination together with your lives assured. And by doing that, that endowment can run way past the 99 years of a capital redemption bond, or, past 100%. And also it's important to understand that an international trust is sometimes very expensive to run. So rather substituting it with the life insurance bond is a much simpler and cheaper option. And in terms of the Life Insurance or the Long-Term Insurance Act, Section 63 can afford protection from creditors for an endowment. There's certain things that need to be present. It has to run at least 3 years, but very importantly, there has to be lives assured attached to it. And then in terms of a life insurance bond, you have the option of nominating a beneficiary of proceeds. So if you are in a planning scenario where you would like the contract to end at the death of the last life assured and have a beneficiary of proceeds nomination, you can do that. And then further to the succession planning conversation, you will find that on a life insurance bond, you can nominate a successor contract owner like you can on a sinking fund, but you also can, as I mentioned, have a beneficiary of proceeds. So depending on the circumstances, you can implement the succession plan as you want.
Both options are both
on the
options
life
available.
Plan,
yeah. It brings us to another question, and that is, if I have a choice, should I go with successor contract owner or beneficiary of proceeds? The principle behind this selection is simple. Must the policy pay out at death, or should the new owner have control over the liquidation process? Simple question. Now, scenarios where control over the payment may be required include the following. I've mentioned deferral of CGT or postponement of CGT when I discussed the sinking fund. The same applies here. Do you want to manage the liquidation process when and what times you are going to make withdrawals, make switches, and thereby activate the CGT? Next scenario would be liquidation in unfavorable market circumstances. The example I always use is if you had to liquidate an investment in March 2020 when the market was down 20% due to COVID. If you had a choice, you would have said, let me wait and see if I can wait 18 months, and 18 months later there was a lot of profit to take. So that's a second example where you don't want to be forced to liquidate. And then the third scenario is with the rise of IPSPs, share portfolios, we've seen notes and instruments with a maturity date inside those portfolios that often are tied to a future date in order to fully materialize their profit. So it means that if you have instruments like that inside your portfolio, you can manage, or the persons inheriting the policy or receiving the ownership can decide when they want to liquidate. So those are three of the most important considerations in deciding beneficiary of proceeds or successor. But Marius, there are also characteristics on sinking fund and life insurance bond that are the same. So whether you choose the one or the other, you will get both.
Correct.
They will get the same benefits. Yeah. Can you expand on that?
Sure. So on both the sinking fund and the life insurance bond, you will find that there's a 100 policy structure underneath, and that really talks to a client that wants to have multiple withdrawals in the time period of the investment. On both, there is something from a succession planning point of view called joint and survivorship between spouses. So you can find that on both of the endowments. Both of them are obviously via Momentum Wealth International, domiciled in Guernsey, and there is obviously a tax-neutral jurisdiction. And then the other important thing to remember is that the tax administration is done for the client, so they don't have to worry about it. It's done with the endowment. It's done within the endowment policy. And then the tax arbitrage opportunity always exists for individuals in higher tax brackets. As we all know that within the 5-fund tax approach, that tax rate's instead at 30% income tax and 12% capital gains tax. So you could benefit from those tax rates if you're in a higher tax bracket. We talked about the succession nomination, and if you have that in play, you can avoid executors' fees. So if you nominate joint and survivorship, or your beneficiary of proceeds or successor contract owners, the contract overriding arrangement doesn't need the executor to intervene, so you save that. And then once again, talking to the overriding contractual arrangements, not only now on our products can you have beneficiaries of proceeds on the life insurance bond, there's also now the option for alternative beneficiary of proceeds. And on the sinking fund, you can have successor contract owners, but there's also now the option of alternative successor contract owners. So, there's a lot of similarities, and it really talks to overriding contractual arrangements to, really take care of intergenerational wealth transfer.
I previously mentioned that the CRB can also often be used for specific outcomes or structures. One of those is asset swap. Can you tell our viewers more about the Momentum Wealth International asset swap offering?
Sure. You will see that we'll have a slide on the screen that really is going to explain a few topics. So let me start with that. If you look at the screen on the left-hand side, you will notice the traditional way of doing an asset swap. So an asset swap, traditionally, you will use the wealth platform. And on the wealth platform, you'll either use the actual platform's asset swap capacity, or you can use feeder funds. Now, the important point to make in the traditional way of doing asset swap and on the local platform, there's two things at play. First of all, from a capital gains tax point of view, we look at the growth of the underlying asset or the investment or investment component. But we also look at the starting point of the Rand conversion rate as well as the end conversion rate of the Rand.
So two drivers of return.
100%. And as we all know, the Rand will depreciate over time, and it's done so over any meaningful period of time. So in your capital gains tax calculation, both of those factors, Rand depreciation and the growth of the fund, comes into the capital gains tax calculation. So that's a traditional way to do an asset swap, say for a company or a local trust, because a local company and trust don't have the 1 million and 10 million Rand offshore allowance like an individual has. On the right hand of the screen, you will notice that we do exactly the same investment, but what we're doing now is we're doing it through the MWI platform. And the main difference is the CGT calculation. And you will note in that CGT calculation, we only look at the growth of the fund and then convert it at the spot rate at time, which means that we do not bookmark or look at the Rand depreciation as an inclusion in the capital gains tax calculation. And on screen, you can see that it can have a meaningful impact over time on the actual CGT payable by the client. So having said that, if we move into the asset swap on the MWI platform, we will look at this, and the main reason, Hannes, is why that calculation on the right-hand side doesn't include the Rand depreciation is due to something called a functional currency.
Yeah.
So in our calculation, on the right-hand side, MWI uses functional currency in its calculations.
I get that question a lot about functional currency and where does it come from? How can you do this? And the answer is simple. It's a definition that's given in Section 1 of the Income Tax Act defining the functional currency.
Okay.
Essentially meaning that if a company is doing business in a specific currency, it can calculate its taxation in that currency. General statement, that's what it boils down to. And because MWI is a Guernsey-based branch model company doing business in dollars, we can do the calculation in dollars. And that's why, to all the accountants out there, we can use functional currency when we do this calculation. But Marius, back to you.
Yeah, 100% agree with that. So that takes care of the tax calculation. Now, because that tax calculation is so attractive, one would argue that a company, a local company and trust wouldn't want to do it the traditional way because it could, harm them from a capital gains tax point of view. So what does the solution look like for a asset swap on MWI? So if you look at the screen on the slide on the screen at the moment, you will notice that the investment for an asset swap is very similar to an individual doing the investment. The only difference is, as I mentioned earlier, an individual has a 1 million rand and 10 million rand allowance, and they use that to externalize money. Companies and trusts don't have it. That's why they do the asset swap. So what we'll need to do when we do an MWI asset swap for a company and trust, we'll have to introduce a third party or an asset swap provider, but the more technical term is a prudential limit capacity provider. The company or trust in South Africa will then borrow their asset swap capacity to do the investment through MWI. Now, all asset swaps, as we know, it's rands in and rands out. So the flow of money will go from Momentum Wealth International to the asset swap provider, which will do two things. They'll convert the currency as well as lend out their asset swap capacity. The investment will be with Momentum Wealth International. And then when it comes to withdrawal stage, Hannes, because it's rand in and rands out, unfortunately, we can't pay the money out offshore. So the money will return from MWI to the asset swap provider, and the asset swap provider will pay it back out to that company or trust in rands. And that's how you will do it, typically through a capital redemption bond, because as we discussed earlier, we don't want lives assured attached, so we won't use the life insurance bond in most instances. We'll use the capital redemption bond to facilitate this asset swap endowment investment for local trusts and local companies on the MWI platform.
And if I can add, even individuals who, for whatever reason, can't externalize funds, they can also follow
100%. And they'll also qualify for functional currency calculation from a CGT perspective. Quite right.
Individuals who used up their annual allowance can't get additional allowance or permission to take out additional amounts, or for whatever reason, they can also make use of this.
100%.
Marius, to quote a famous rugby player, at the end of the day, the selection between life insurance bond and capital redemption bond will depend on your client and their needs. One is not better than the other. We like to think that the life insurance bond is better, but ultimately it depends on your client. One might be more right for your client. But the important thing is that the selection between these two options will often depend on your analysis of the client's unique situation. And to help you in that selection process, MWI not only has a contingent of specialists from legal, fiduciary, investment specialists available, but we also have a comprehensive library of endowment publications drafted by our legal advisors, available on Advisor Connect. And these documents can assist you as an advisor to help you in that process of analyzing what product would be best for your client. We strongly encourage our viewers to go and visit this library. Thank you very much.